Fantastic. I think we're close enough to a quorum that I'll just get us started. I'm very excited here tonight. This is a very special occasion for us at the GTU to welcome back a graduate of our program, now published author, Angela Botelho. We're so thrilled to be hosting this conversation. Angela's book, German Jews and the Persistence of Jewish Identity in Conversion, Writing the Jewish Self, is the kind of the conversation piece of tonight. I have to hold it up here. I read this book. I was blessed to have the time and chance to read it, and it just got my mind so alive with questions about Jewishness, about identity. And I learned so much. So I guess I'll say to everyone, please go ahead and get the book. You can order it locally here in Berkeley through Afikoman or other ways that you get your books. But it's a very powerful experience to read. And I'll just say a little bit about your book, Angela. You tell multiple stories in this book. You're telling your story, members of your family, generations of German Jews, and actually to the extent that you're talking about a dynamic that is kind of pertains not just to the German Jewish experience, but to Jewish identity writ large, you're really telling the story of Jewish history and identity formation over time. And all of this done through interviews with family members, but then a critical apparatus that provides frameworks for thinking about this phenomenon. Those of you who don't know Angela, I'll tell you a little bit about her. Angela Kuttner-Botelho received her master's degree here at the GTU. Her master's thesis treated the metaphor of the Murano as a means by which to understand a variety of Jewish identities in history, especially modern ones. And her book, in many ways, is a culmination of a series of academic papers and publications on this aspect of modern Jewish identity. Her background includes a career as Deputy Attorney General for the state of California, as well as advanced degrees in French literature and community mental health. Angela is currently a visiting scholar at the GTU, and I know that you, Angela, feel grateful to be able to participate in academic life here at the GTU, but I would say that we at the GTU are grateful that you're bringing your ideas to the conversation here on Holy Hill. We feel very grateful to you. So I welcome you, and I welcome everybody here, and a quick note of thank you to Matthew Hartman, who is the program coordinator for our center, and whose work in bringing tonight's program together was essential. And we thank you, Matt, for everything that you've done. So thank you. Angela, welcome.
Thank you so much for that very fulsome introduction, Deena. And I've spent many years in conversation with you as a student, and now in the process of talking about this book. And it's always been a very rewarding experience to talk to you, which is why I'm so grateful we're in this dialogue with each other for the benefit of all the people who have tuned in. And I just want to say that the Center for Jewish Studies has been completely and utterly essential to my development as a thinker and as a Jew and as a Jewish intellectual, and as a member of a very exciting community in the world of Jewish studies. And the fact that I bring that experience to telling a very personal story in many ways is, to me, it's a big part of what has happened to me as a result of my contact with you and with Naomi Seidman. So thank you.
Oh. Well, as everybody here can see, Angela and I have an ongoing conversation, and now we're just adding a chapter to that. And I want to dive right into talking about your book. I want to go right into it. One of the ways that I think about your book, because your book is doing two things. It's telling the history of German Jewish identity more broadly, and it's telling your own family history through interviews with siblings, through portraits of your parents. I sometimes think about your book as almost like a two-way mirror. It's clear to me that as you learned about modern German Jewry, you came to better understand your own personal and family experience, like certain mysterious, unspoken aspects of your childhood that began to make sense as you acquired an understanding of these larger trends of modern German Jewish life. But then at the same time, your own experience is now shedding light on German Jewish history. Because as your book so beautifully shows, you are illuminating the threads of Jewishness that persist beyond the baptismal font. So I was wondering if you could just tell us more about this two-way mirror, how your family life is making sense of German Jewish history, how German Jewish history is making sense of your family life.
Well, that's a really excellent question. And perhaps I should begin, before even answering the question, to read you a brief section about, which is my preface of my book, because it will situate this book for those of you who have never heard of me or don't know me. And you'll start to get it a little bit. So, and then I will come back to your very interesting question, because it's the aftermath of the preface. The preface is from my childhood, and I'll read it to you now. Picture us, a large German Jewish refugee family, become Catholic in the 1940s and early 50s in Washington, D.C. Eventually, there would be 9 children, the first 3 born in Rome between 1934 and 1940, and the next 6 in America between 1942, that would be me, and 1953. My father, a scholar, remote as I remember him, buried in his study, cigarettes and wine at hand. My mother, warm, emotive, single-handedly managing her large household with a characteristic touch of iron. We children a gang, high-spirited, close in age, immensely aware of one another and our relationships. My mother often recounted to us our origin story. This is how I remember it. Here is how we escaped the Nazis, my mother would begin. We lived in Rome in an apartment near grandparents nearby. It was 1940. Nazis and fascists were everywhere. Your father had gone into hiding, making his way to Portugal. He had a job offer in America and was waiting for us. I had the 2 little boys with me. By the time your sister was born and I was able to travel, it had become impossible to get exit papers. We, your grandparents, your father and I, were all very worried. I decided to kill the children if they came to arrest us. I had bought poison pills for this purpose. Or perhaps I would send them away into the countryside with our Italian maid. I had already been called in for questioning and had no travel papers. There was a glamorous Italian woman who lived in our building. Everyone despised her because she often was seen with high-ranking fascist officials. Almost a prostitute, people thought. I sort of liked her, though. She was high-spirited and funny and had beautiful clothes. We were always cordial to one another. One day, soon after your sister was born, she saw me crying in our building's common area. What's wrong, she asked. I am a Jew. I'm afraid we'll all be killed, my children with me. I have no papers and cannot leave. She laughed, rather affectionately, almost teasingly. Oh, is that your problem? Don't worry, I can get your papers for you easily from one of my friends. And so she did. What struck me so much about this story, and I'm talking, it was a pre-literate level that I was hearing these stories at 3 and 4. Terror. For years, I dreamed the Nazis would come and get me. Even more starkly, the unimaginable idea that my mother would kill her children, us, me. And then there was the mystery, the statement that rang out so sharply, I am a Jew. What did that mean? I knew my mother was Catholic, as was my father. We went to church every Sunday. From these beginnings to my own well-established Jewish identity is not the story I tell here. What does preoccupy me is the role of storytelling itself as the fixed point in the establishment of Jewish identity, which is one reason why my subtitle is called Writing the Jewish Self. We have only to look at the Hebrew Bible, stories. family stories. The point here is that our family history, officially that is a prolific American Catholic family, my father, a leading scholar of medieval canon law, had a subtext of something quite different, something hidden, dangerous, indeed life-threatening, and immensely powerful. We were Jews, whatever that meant. So it's funny, the preface is the very first thing I wrote in my book. I couldn't believe it. I just sat this down and wrote this in one sitting. The rest of it was a ton more painful, but this one came right out. So in answer to your question, Deena, about history and our story and history, I just want to say that I did not know that we were Jews came out at different points throughout my childhood and adolescence, and I described that in the book. But as far as I knew, we were the only Jews I know who had ever been converted. And it was only when I got to the GTU and heard Naomi Seidman, I took a course in modern Jewish history, talk about the Marranos, that I sort of jumped out of my chair and kind of spontaneously said, oh my God, I thought we were the only ones. And it was just a revelation to me. And at that moment is when I decided to enroll in the graduate program rather than just auditing. So, I learned about the 19th century reform movement and also what's called the Toph epidemic. A large number of German Jews converted to Christianity in the 19th century and even early 20th, my father included. And there's been a lot of Toph epidemic means conversion epidemic. It turns out it wasn't an epidemic, but it was about 7% of Jews throughout that period. And I had a lot of questions about this, and I thought about that a lot. And I read a lot about this, but literally everything I read was, it was kind of a sociological analysis, which Jews converted from which professions and what happened with all these groups. And Todd Endelman is a major scholar of that sociology. But as you mentioned earlier, my take is the story stopped at the baptismal font with the act of baptism. And my story begins after. What happens to the Jew within? And as far as I know, nobody has written about that except for this one study on Russian Jews in the 19th century and in the countryside. So it had nothing really to do with my family or German Jews. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yes. So in a sense, your family experience is allowing you to add a chapter to our general understanding of German Jewry and conversion, the place of conversion in the history of German Jewry, and then, of course, what kinds of Jewishness persist even after conversion.
Right, and so that was my project. I was, as I was writing my master's degree, and there's a lot of stuff about the Marranos, I thought, well, I just conceived this project, like I want to interview everyone in my family. And I have a large family. We were prolific. So there was 9 children and 25 grandchildren. And I interviewed each and every one of these people all over the country, dragging my husband along with the videotape equipment and everything. And it was a completely amazing experience because each and every one of those people in their own idiosyncratic ways, in the interview would say, well, of course I'm a Jew. And none of us, well, there's a short exception here, none of us had been raised with Jews within a Jewish community with the traditional Jewish upbringing that you, Deena, are very involved in with your kids. And so that was the question, like, why are all these people saying there are Jews and what do they mean by it? And this brought me to my strong belief towards the end of the book about what Jewish identity can be. That yes, not me, because I'm kind of all the way in now, but we are Jews at the margins. And I would say historically, it's always been true that there's a lot of Jews at the margins. And it's right in the Bible. Well, we've got Ruth, we've got Moses, for that matter, raised in a completely different culture. And yet what made him say, wait a minute, I'm a Jew, or I'm an Israelite. There were no Jews that way.
Yes, one of the things that struck me, and again, your book is, as I just to share with everybody here, it really is a composite of certain kind of analytical frameworks for thinking about this phenomenon, given that, Angela, you're thinking about it in this critical, sustained way for, one of the first to really do so in this kind of way. And then you also have these very personal family reports and interviews, portraits of your father, portraits of your mother, which we'll come to in a little bit. But even, I would say, one of the things that struck me was the looseness with which you're I almost think about trying on clothing. You try on different ways of thinking about the identities taken up by members of your family. Like there's a whole panoply of options to try on to make sense of these Jewish formations, because we're not looking for some kind of mainstream stereotype version of Jewishness. You allow for a spectrum, wondering whether one sibling's studiousness is evocative maybe of a yeshiva bacher, someone who studies Talmud all day, or maybe that's even in part what fed your father's scholarship, or a family member who's giving expression to a Jewish leftist activist modality, or the way that Bildung as a German value is a way that could help you to understand the emphasis on education and cultural formation in your household, the Jewish matriarch to make sense of your mother. So the metaphor of Murano, the classical hidden Jew, as a way to make sense of your family. I mean, I would love to ask you, which of these typologies was strongest for you in understanding maybe yourself or your family and its trajectory?
Well, that's a really good question also. It's true that I was astonished to find out not only that everyone basically said, of course I'm a Jew, but also that these what do you call them, archetypes or whatever, that our family is so incredibly Jewish. There's like the musicians and the this and the that. And but I think that what I found the most interesting was the Murano, which I was very interested in when I was in graduate school. And in particular, Yerushalmi and also a man named Yirmiyahu Yovel have written extensively about the Murano. And Yovel in particular talks about the Jew within, and he talks about the phenomenon. I'm assuming everyone here knows who the Murano is, but quickly. In Spain, Spain practiced a bunch of forced conversions, and we're talking on beginning in 1391, and a lot of people were, and Portugal too, were automatically Christianized under pain of death, and then those people, as new Christians, have received a Christian upbringing in school, and the universities were all Christian, and so forth. And then when the Inquisition came and people started fleeing to Northern Europe for freedom, a lot of them returned to Judaism, to a traditional Judaism. But what Yovel in particular points out is, so whereas, okay, I'm a Murano in Spain, so I have a Christian exterior, and I have, in whatever form it is, very attenuated usually, a Jewish. There's another thing going on here, and I know it, but I can't really, say anything too much about it. And then the rebellion against authority, which led them to, say, Amsterdam, and Spinoza is a classic example, also led them to, okay, now I've got these rabbis in charge. Well, I'm rebelling against them. That's the new church. That's the new religious establishment. And I am going to be a modern rationalist, or I hesitate. I'm not going to sum up Spinoza, but so that you always have a kind of doubleness about, and it just reverses. So I found that so compelling, because so many of my interviewees would go, well, of course I'm Jewish, but I don't know anything about it. I frequently heard that statement from my interviewees. And in many cases, that was true. I mean, I chose to study, and others in my family did, but a lot of them didn't. We're talking about, a lot of people here. But in various ways, their Jewishness came out, and including this cover, which I have to mention. Oops, I'm very bad at doing this. Which is a picture of the road to Rosensweig. Now, thank you. A photo taken by a totally secular atheist brother who lives in and works in Italy. He took a trip to Rosensweig, and another big part of my mother's story was about our great-grandmother who died in Rosensweig. And that, of course, is the reason why everyone goes, that a reason, the Holocaust. Oh, yes, I'm Jewish. But another reason that they cite, and it's what you brought up earlier, Deena, was the way we were raised was very German Jewish Bildung, that concept of education, of knowledge, of broad transnational and cosmopolitan investment in the arts, in the world of the intellect, in the world of law. That all was a very strong part of our family background. I remember when I brought Elvis Presley home, that was not a good move. And so they also, a lot of them really mentioned that. They had an understanding of a culture. And George Massey, who's a prominent scholar of German Jews, talked about how Bildung, this principled ideal version of how to be an intellectual was completely abandoned by the Germans, right? And the Jews were the only one who hung on to it. They were still doing theater and everything in 1943 in Berlin. It's a very tragic thing that the concept, the what we call liberal intellectual concept was, they just abandoned it and became who they became, the Nazis. But
yes, and I think your treatment of Bildung as it took shape in your family is just one example of the ways in your book you don't do the predictable thing in this book. I mean, just want to say this to you and to others. And one of the things that really struck me, it's not like looking for Sabbath candlesticks in the closet, looking for like peak symbolic ritual clues of Jewishness. What you're trying to shine light on are often the undervalued or unseen cultural aspects of an identity, and you're making it visible. So I can't resist but to kind of focus in a little bit and transition a little bit to some of the studies in the book itself. And I just realized now that my questions in a way are out of order. I really enjoyed the fact that you begin with a chapter about your mother, a mother's tale, and really explore the place of narration and storytelling in the transmission of some notion of Jewishness. We'll get to that. I found myself wanting to talk with you first about the chapter about your father, prominent, world-renowned scholar of canon law, Christian canon law. And the chapter, I mean, it's almost haunted in your effort. It's titled "In Search of the Hidden Jew." You are doing your best to tease out what you see as threads of Jewishness with a lot of compassion. In the chapter, in a way, I was struck by the fact that it's sort of a conversation with your father. It begins with you reflecting, you see your father's eyes in your own eyes. It's a very personal, intimate start. And it even concludes with this kind of imagined, whispered conversation as you're traversing the campus at UC Berkeley and you're kind of thinking of him, and declare at the end of the chapter, "I am like you." So another kind of mirroring. And so here you're writing this chapter about your father and speaking to him and exploring his Jewishness. In his absence, he has passed away. What was that like to be in conversation with your father in that way? And if I could even ask, how might he have responded to your kind of pulling him out of hiding, as it were? Would it be welcome?
Well, this gets us to our concept. I have to start with by saying that my father was had a conversion of conviction. He believed in it. He was a student of canon law, which is very important. Canon law is at the origin of all European criminal and property law. So it was and he was a scholar of medieval canon law. So he spent his whole life locating these obscure manuscripts and then interpreting them in the context of each other and so on and so forth. In short, my father was a total Talmudic scholar, is what I want to say in terms of a Jewish stereotype. He kept, absent from the family, always in his house of studies or his own home study. And he produced at a prodigious rate and, did become world renowned for his scholarship. So, but his family,
what about, you mentioned his conversion of, of faith? What was that? What do you know?
He was studying in Rome. He was studying in the Vatican, doing research on all these obscure documents and stuff. And, he was part of a generation in the Weimar Republic of people. There was a lot of questioning about religious identity. And so we have, on the one hand, Rosensweig. Most of us are familiar with the story of Rosensweig. He was going to convert. His cousins converted. His very best friend converted to Christianity in a search for meaning in the aftermath of the disillusionment of World War I. And so Rosenzweig, especially persuaded by his friend, they wrote an amazing book together. There's a story about how he said, okay, I'm going to convert, but I think I should, go to he went to an come from a Jewish place specifically. So he went to an Orthodox synagogue for Yom Kippur, and lo and behold, he has the magic moment where he says, Ich bleibe also Jüdisch. He says, I'm going to stay a Jew. And he had a spiritual experience. Well, my father, in an interview that towards the end of his life with one of my brothers, talks about an experience he had in a basilica in Rome while he was a student there. And he was in his early 20s. It was postdoc time. And, how he was overwhelmed and in a Roman basilica. And he was like, okay, I'm going this way. Now, he was not raised really in a Jewish household in terms of his father had become a Lutheran for political and career reasons. But it just struck me, the similarity. That's kind of how I see my father. He was a part of that generation. And then the other way I see him as a Jew, and this was really my main point I wanted to make, was not only, it had to do with his involvement with law as the center of a religious experience. And he wrote a really interesting tract that I quoted in the book, where he talks about Christian law now as it's a three-part thing. There's God, there's law, and there's society. So the whole thing is a sacred enterprise with the law at the center. I'm reading this and I'm going, this is Judaism. This is totally Judaism. And it informed his life. I mean, I cannot tell you how many hours he spent in the study, really. It's incredible. So I see him, with the concept of law as faith as law at the center of a God-man law thing, triad. It's like Rosensweig for that matter. It's very interesting to me.
Wow. So, and could you guess at whether this take would be well received, if I can ask, by him? If you could guess it.
Well, my father believed in supersessionism, I have to say. He thought Christianity was the next best thing. He was who he was. And he had a very active faith. But there's this whole other side of him too. Like when he met my new beau, that's my husband Barry, who's Jewish. So I was around 50 by then. And so I was introducing Barry to my dad, and my dad immediately gestures to my mother to bring out this document. And it's a document from his it's like it's an official document of the University of Berlin that lists the graduates and their year, and by his name, which he had written down, his faith was a nonconformist or something like that. That was before he became a Christian. There was a big giant dark black J scrawled right over it. Someone was going through those records and marking out the Jews. This was a 1930 PhD listing from the University of Berlin. And so he shows it to my boyfriend. And I feel that my dad was saying something to Barry as a way of welcoming him into our family. Of like, I'm a Jew. I'm like you, you know.
Wow.
So I think a direct question, and I guess I should also just quickly throw in the concept of naming, you know, that Derrida talks about the naming of a Jew as blow, and Naomi Simon also refers to that as even a gender-based blow. So yeah, my father would say, it's not that he denied he was Jewish, but it was not the life he had chosen for himself. Although I think it kept seeping out, which is part of my thing, the persistence of Jewish identity, one of my really strongest beliefs, which Heinrich Heine articulated. You just can't splash water on somebody to turn them into something else. It doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Yes, well, your part of what your book does is makes clear that Jewishness, as any ethnicity really, it's multifactorial. There are many factors, and state declarations of belief are arguably of minor importance, you know.
Well, it is what I think. I mean, I really take a position that our family's totally Jewish, maybe on the margins. I use the term points of light, you know, out there. I'm often asked, well, when was the moment when you know, and I always have to say, you know, there was no moment. It was sort of like through a glass darkly. I had different experiences throughout my life, which I recount in the book, where I'm like, but wait, I'm totally Jewish. But I had a lot of fear about entering the Jewish community, that I, you know, sort of officially, that I would not be accepted. And that changed when I joined a congregation, Bethel, here in Berkeley, with my husband, Barry, who hadn't been in a synagogue since his bar mitzvah. But, you know, we just kind of totally fit in. So then I really, but yeah.
Well, so this, like when you say there wasn't a moment, it's like at various episodes in your life, it would surface some sense of, like you were saying with the Murano, some sense of a self that's doesn't quite correspond to the Christian self, the girl who went to Catholic school. And I would love to actually talk about that, the formation of your Jewish self and your mother's role in it. And the chapter, I love the title, Mother's Tale. And in that chapter, just as in the preface you read to us from the preface, which is a paraphrase of a history that you recall your mother telling you repeatedly throughout your childhood. So it's some kind of composite paraphrase of many tellings. So she told the tale. She narrated a part of your family's Jewish history. You know, when would she do that? Were there peak moments where suddenly the role of storyteller she would just assume that role?
Well, one thing that emerged from the interviews is that my mother told this story that she told me to everyone multiple times. So we're talking one of my brothers is deceased, so I didn't get a chance to interview him, but all of my siblings and all of the grandchildren said, oh yes, Grandma would tell us this story of their escape from the Nazis. And of course, especially since I conducted these interviews when the grandchildren were already in their early 40s or so, late 30s, it made a huge impression on her, and she told the stories over and over. She obsessively told these stories. And then towards the end of her life, when she was in her 80s, she actually wrote down her stories, which was an amazing thing for her. My mother was not a scholar. English wasn't quite her language. It was and it wasn't. And she put it in written form, which is also extremely powerful. And I talk about that a lot in the book, you know, and analyze it and stuff. And you'll enjoy it. So that was the main thing. Like, even, you know, it was always, you know, the Holocaust was present in our lives. And that is, in my mind, such an our great-great-grandmother perished in Rosensweig. I think I said that earlier, was murdered, my mother would always say, which was true. And so you can't just walk away from that. That's what I keep thinking. None of us could really walk away from that and say, well, I don't know anything about it. I've never been to a bar mitzvah or any of that. It did not matter. What mattered was the story. And I think this, and that is why one of the reasons I think of my mom as totally Jewish. We're talking about oral history, reduced to writing at a certain point in time. I mean, and then the story she told herself was the Exodus story. We were in this strange land, we were oppressed. God intervened in the form of this high-class prostitute, and we got out and came to the promised land, America. You know, it was so powerful the way that she did that. And that, I think, is, you know, certainly a large part of our Jewish identity was my mother's storytelling.
I mean, I was really struck in the chapter, A Mother's Tale. I think that's the chapter that appears.
Yeah.
You talk about almost like a ritualized telling of a tale of sorts at age 13 or 14.
Yeah, you and I discussed
willing
this.
To maybe read that?
I'll read that. So this happened. Let's see. I talk about this thing that happened. There were the various incidents that happened with my mother, and I talk about this one. Most striking in my mind is the sort of rite of passage instruction of our adolescence. Did each of us receive the same instruction? Apparently so, per my recent informal survey. I remember mine vividly. At some point in my early adolescence, at the age of 13 or 14 perhaps, me, a student in a private Catholic girls' high school, and I just want to make an aside here for a moment to say that I myself left Catholicism as sometime soon after that, because, you know, I didn't like it. You know, it was the women's movement, and all they could talk about was birth control and stuff. So it was that part of it, the faith that I had as a child, learned in school. I had left that on my own, but it kind of left me in nowhere land. But anyway, to go on, myself at the age of 13 or 14, perhaps, a student in a private Catholic girls' high school, my mother took me aside. This was a striking event in itself. There were very few private conversations in our crowded household. In a markedly serious, hushed tone, she said to me, as I recall it, "You are getting older now. Someday you will fall in love and perhaps want to marry. When this happens, you must tell the person you love that you are a Jew. He might not want to marry you." Of course, we're assuming here heterosexual. What rang in my ears the most at that time, marriage seemed very far off to me, was the harsh, almost scolding voice she used to deliver this incredibly startling pronouncement. "You are a Jew." She had never before directly said that to me, never before called me a Jew, and she did not so now with a force and clarity that I would never forget. And a little later, I talk about this. When I asked my siblings, you know, did this happen to you? And they said yes, and a couple of them said, oh, it was a protective gesture on her part. But I would phrase it a little differently. I'd say that she was trying to warn us, a warning stemming from her own hidden pain. Warn us of the possibility, inevitability even, of an ever-looming assault, a blow. Warn us that we were and would always be Jews, the other, and how prescient indeed in today's post-Charlottesville era in my own country of birth. I'm only grateful that my mother did not live to see it. And so I would say that my mother's experience of Jews, she was totally unschooled in Judaism. The family was completely secular Jews. No one else in the family converted, but that was my mother's family, and that was the social milieu that she lived in. And the German Jewish refugees that I knew a little bit as a child were the same type of secular Jews. So my mother really didn't know anything about Judaism. But what I think is so amazing is that she kind of captured this quintessential, let's say this somewhere, bat mitzvah moment, 13 or 14, where you're called upon to accept Jewishness in a serious adult way. And that's kind of what she did. She's like, this is going to affect your life. It's who you are. And the most vivid thing about it to me is that it's an assault, which I think as Judaism experienced as an assault, which is the way Derrida talks about it. And Naomi too, in a way, like the assault of circumcision, which is gender-based as well. That, again, my mother was just picking up these patterns and she couldn't help but do them. I mean, that's why my mother was so overtly Jewish without ever teaching us a thing about ritual Judaism or anything like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. I feel like I could ask more and reflect more, but I also want to make sure we take time in this conversation to hear from the people who are here, and I'm just so happy again that so many of you are here. So please feel free to put questions into the Q&A. I'm going to moderate them and have a look and then pose them to Angela, but please take a moment to put some questions in. We already have one question in, Angela, that I'd love to ask you. Given that you're emphasizing these patterns that you said that just showed up in your mother and that she transmitted to you through these tales and through certain attitudes and cultural postures, you're identifying a persistence of Jewish identity even in a population converted to Christianity. Mm-hmm. Have you considered what this might suggest about the inverse situation, which is someone who converts to Judaism? They are not bringing, presumably, along with themselves these inherited patterns. Mm-hmm. Where does that put them? Can they never be Jewish?
Well, that's a really good question. I happen to know a number of Jewish people who converted to Judaism, and especially one of my best friends. And I think that's kind of a serious question. I mean, one thing, it's why to me the image of the Marana is important. Like, I do carry not a Christian self in terms of belief systems or Jesus Christ or any of that, but a kind of our ritual, our Christmas ritual is something that comes up for me. My family's Christmas ritual when we were children, which was very beautiful. And it was a time our family was happy. And I often notice when I'm at Seders and stuff that I feel, well, wait a minute, this isn't mine. I don't feel all this nostalgia and warm washing, whatever, about my family, because I have a different one. So I expect that, I've never really posed this question, but I think that converts too, you have to deal with where you came from. And I've tried to do that in my book, but I'm assuming they too do. You can't cut away from your family. Maybe that's one of my beliefs. And your family, what your family instills with you. And I've actually spoken to a number of people. One woman is married to a cousin of mine who's Jewish, and she grew up a Methodist, and she said the book made her start thinking a lot about, she completely left her Methodist upbringing. She thought it was stultifying and terrible and all that. But she's like, yeah, I'm still carrying it. And we had this conversation about what she was carrying. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I don't want to say you can't convert to Judaism, it's not that. But I'm saying you're going to carry your baggage, and I'm carrying my baggage. And this book was an attempt to come to terms with that. And as you'll see in the interviews, every single person had their own response about how they have come to terms with their Judaism.
Thank you. There is a question, just a clarification, some confusion about your family tree and its conversion history.
Okay.
Would you be willing just to say again, mother, father, you?
Okay. My father became a Christian of conviction, and my mother and father got married in 1933, and he brought her along, very traditional. Jews do this too. You have to be like me, and so they were baptized right before their wedding in 1933. And
shall I show the picture right there?
Yeah, that'd be great. There they are. That's at the civil ceremony, and then you can show the one below. That's at the backyard wedding. So the backyard wedding, they had a priest officiate, and then the civil ceremony, they had to go to, go to court. And my mother always tells a story about it. They went to court and they had to do Heil Hitler. They were in an official, right. And she was so upset about it. And then they came into their own backyard wedding, their real wedding. And she insisted on playing Mendelssohn's wedding march. There was a little band or something, which was already banned, a bard at that time. So this is Felix Mendelssohn, the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn. So my mother did these subversive gestures throughout her entire history as a Catholic. She didn't want to leave it behind. She refused to leave it behind, that she was a Jew, and she was very clear about that. I forgot what this was. So anyway, that's them. We were all raised as Catholics. None of us, so there's 9 kids and a bunch of grandchildren. Only one person out of that whole 25 people remained a Catholic, my oldest brother. And he raised his 6 kids as Catholics. Not one of them remained a Catholic. So, and then one of my brothers, another brother who's become very involved with Judaism, raised his kids as Jews in New Brunswick, Canada, where he was a professor at the law school there. And in that community, his wife was a Jewish convert. In that community, the only shul was an Orthodox one, a small Orthodox shul, and they refused to recognize my brother or his family as Jews. And so the children of my brother, it's very interesting, the only ones who were raised as Jews in this group of people. It's interesting to read their take on it all. And so, I just want to say there's fault on all sides. There's a lot of Jewish gatekeeping about you're not good enough, you're not right, you don't have this or you don't have that. And my thing is, I think, it's kind of stupid.
Right. You just said so beautifully how you're not arguing for some kind of essentialist, you're not making an argument about what it is to be essentially Jewish, some like quality of the person that will never go away. It is socially constructed. It's constructed through patterns of social life and cultural life, storytelling, things that are transmitted. And so when you said, in terms of conversion, that you can't cut yourself from your family. You're going to carry your past as an individual, and you're going to carry your family's past. And what your book is an effort to render that visible and to deal with it. So it's a very personal project, but it also says something more broadly. And there were a few questions that came in just asking, I wonder how many descendants of these of the German Jewish, this scene that you described and that you come from, how many are there? Are people going to be reading your book and saying, oh, that's me, I see myself there? I mean, other people writing that they feel they've had similar experiences in a high school, that high school was the moment when they suddenly were told, like the blow that you said, they were told of their Jewishness. So to what extent do you have a hope, I don't know, an ambition that this book is going to enable a large number of people to see themselves differently?
Well, I guess, let me just say this. I think we're in an era where it's postmodern. The whole idea of identity as being complex and multiple and intersectional is really a big part of our culture. I just heard a very interesting lecture by a Jew of color who's become the new head of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And she was talking about that whole phenomenon in Genesis. So, you know, and there's Madeleine Albright. She found out she was a Jew as an adult. I can't even imagine what that would be like. There's Helen Epstein wrote a very interesting book about her experience with her Jewish background, and that was concealed. Her family was Episcopalian. So they were from Europe, they're from Czechoslovakia. So, you know, I guess what I really want most of all for my book is to generate a conversation about Jewish identity and how it's always, there's always been Jews. I mean, back in the olden days, you know, there were Hellenistic Jews versus the Temple Jew, you know, there's always been this discussion of what happens when you spread out from the center. What happens to people and how do they continue to be Jews? And I think the answers are multiple, and I think they're complex. I don't think I have had the last word on this subject, but it would be great if it opened up some conversation.
May I ask, just because I have the mic, what was your favorite, what did you enjoy writing most? Because
My favorite chapter?
Yeah, the book has so many different chapters, portraits of your parents, interviews of siblings, your own child, grandchildren. What was your favorite? Yeah, which is your favorite part, I guess?
Well, my favorite story, I'll tell you that, is the story of my brother Francis, who's the one who made the photo on the book. His story, which consists of an email he sent us all right before our first family reunion after my parents had passed away, was just this like amazing literary masterpiece to me. And it almost had to do with going down this road, the road of the cover, and just like I myself had never gone to a concentration camp, and I've been to Europe many times. You know, there's like, I don't want to go all the way in, but he did. And it was just such an amazing journey. And then he took this photo. And so the other favorite part of so I want you all to read Francis's story, but I also really like my conclusion, you know, which is when I talk about trying to reconfigure our lost tribe and what that meant and how actually everyone reconfigured themselves. I didn't have to tell them. They knew they were Jews. And just some of the conclusions I reached about all of that. So I personally am fond of my conclusion. There's concepts in there, concept of translation, you know, the afterlife of a text, for those of you who are familiar with Benjamin. And I think it's an important message for now because the world is full of changing identities. People are changing continents and countries, and they're often carrying horrible oppression. And, you know, I think that, you know, rather than I think there's a way in which we have to actively construct our identities and try to understand them. And, you know, a Jewish identity is a super important identity. I don't think that's something you can forget or walk away from completely. I honestly don't. And I compare that to, let's say I found out I was 1/85th African American, that I actually had an ancestor in the Middle Passage on the slave ships, which I don't. But, you know, even though hopefully I'm anti-racist and so on and so forth, I just think having that discovery would completely change my sense of who I was and my entire relationship to to African America. And that's what I think of as Jewish. I mean, there's this whole huge history. It's not just the Holocaust. It's the whole history that we all study. It's just not something you can walk away from. You know, it's too important and too something. I don't know, that's the way it strikes me.
I mean, the imagery that comes to mind is that you're saying it's a time, we're living in a time now of a kind of fragmentation. I mean, a major ruptures are everywhere. And part of what I think your book does is it integrating things, but not by reducing them or simplifying them. The metaphor that organizes the chapter about the grandchildren is called points of light.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that that image was a gift because what it allows for is the spread. It allows for movement, but with a metaphor that gives us a sense of it being nevertheless some kind of constellation with meaning.
Right. I really think that way. And I also think that the shards, you know, in the mystical structure of, you know, we're all shards that are when God spilled into the universe and all. But I think it's the same idea, actually. You know, which of us are whole? Some of us may pretend to be, but, you know, yeah, I thought about this a lot, as you can tell, and I'm still thinking about it, actually.
Well, I think it's time, actually, believe it or not, for us to wrap up. You've given us so much to think about, Angela. And what you've woven together here for all of us I think it's a really important book for our current moment. And I'm seeing some chats coming in, offering thanks, and many of the questions in the comments were from people saying that parts of what you're saying resonate deeply. So thanks everyone for joining us and for saying hello and for your well wishes. Angela, I hope that you'll continue to be a part of our campus life here at the GTU. It's a real gift.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you guys helped give birth to me, I have to say. You helped me pull it together. And all these inchoate moments, and inspired me to write this book. So,
thanks, Angela.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and listening to my story, everyone. And I do hope you'll, you know, somehow or other get a hold of the book and read it. And if you know me, or even if you don't, communicate with me. I'd be really interested in your reactions. And I just want to say that this is not my actual study. This is my fantasy study of when we win the lottery. This will be my study.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you really for coming and listening to this, and I hope it means something to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you, Deena, terrific conversationalist. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Okay, good night.